Hello, everyone. How many of you went through that panic of losing your phone? I just ended the second video of this and then had to find my phone. And I just was on a 15-minute thing. I was calling my phone and I found my phone under some blankets so I couldn't hear the ring. But fortunately, my dogs helped me by doing nothing. So, we got 30 minutes down, 31 to go. Let's do this.
The design process was nearing completion. As 1945 dawned at Los Alamos, Oppenheimer's teams were coming close to completing both the design of the Little Boy and Fat Man. Consequently, there were two plausible candidates for a successfully built nuclear weapon. In the end, both would be completed at roughly the same time, as design problems were worked out in the spring of 1945 and the required levels of enriched uranium and plutonium were produced in the sites in Washington State and Tennessee. The latter were enormous undertakings, given the technology available to the Manhattan Project, as it was extremely costly and time-consuming to enrich these to become fissile substances in the mid-1940s. Other elements which needed to be resolved were engineering problems for the most part. For instance, the Fat Man bomb was being assembled using a huge array of approximately 1,500 bolts in 1944, an impractical amount in order to develop a working bomb. By the time it was completed in the early summer of 1945, Oppenheimer's team had reduced this to just 90 bolts. Other technical issues concerned how the bomb would descend when dropped from a height, and throughout 1944 and 1945, tests were done to assess how a bomb of the size and structure of the Fat Man and Little Boy would fall through the air. All of this came together during the course of the spring of 1945, and by midsummer, Oppenheimer was able to deliver the head of the Manhattan Project, Major General Leslie Groves, the news that they were ready to conduct a test detonation. The Trinity nuclear test was carried out in the Jornada del Muerto Desert in New Mexico on the 16th of July, 1945. Fittingly, the desert's name, translated from the Spanish, means Dead Man's Root. Oppenheimer revealed in correspondence with Groves in 1962 that he codenamed the test Trinity as he had been reading the religious poetry of the 17th century English poet John Donne around the time that he came up with the name. The device which would be used during the test was a Fat Man bomb, using plutonium and of an implosion type. For the purposes of the test, the bomb in question was christened the Gadget. In order for the test to be carried out safely, a location was chosen which was highly remote, almost entirely unpopulated and otherwise isolated. There was only one building on the proposed blast site, the McDonald Ranch House, which had been built there by a German migrant in 1913, and which had been forcefully vacated in 1942 by the McDonald family after the US government took over the region under the remit of the Manhattan Project. The test was a carefully planned thing, as the plutonium which was to be used had cost billions of dollars to produce in today's money. Such were the torturous methods involved in enriching uranium and plutonium at the time. Much hinged on its success. As Groves noted at the time, he didn't want to explain to a congressional committee why he had blown up $1 billion worth of plutonium in the desert for no reason. The Trinity test was carried out near dawn on the morning of the 16th of July. Observation shelters were established in 3 different places to the north, south, and west of the blast site, each approximately 9 kilometers away from where the bomb would be detonated. Goggles were provided to prevent against harmful ultraviolet wavelengths, while the distance was considered safe enough in terms of the radioactive half-life which would be produced. Many of the observers that morning were scientists and included Oppenheimer, Teller, Bethe, Enrico Fermi, and John von Neumann. Some believed that the bomb would not work. Others were concerned about exactly how destructive it could prove to be. They had their answers at 5:29 a.m. when the Gadget exploded, releasing explosive energy equivalent to 25,000 tons of TNT. This created a crater 1/3 of a kilometer wide and melted the sand across the launch site, turning it into a light green glass-like rock. The observers, 9 kilometers away, did not hear the immense noise from the shockwave for 40 seconds after the detonation. But by that time, they were witnessing a growing fireball which changed color from purple, green and orange eventually to white. Then it coalesced into a mushroom cloud, one which eventually spiraled 12 kilometers into the sky. The shock from the explosion was felt nearly 100 kilometers away, while those at the observation shelters 9 kilometers away later recollected that there was a brief period of immense heat, like they were standing in front of an open oven for a few seconds momentarily, when the bomb detonated. Oppenheimer's supposed words as he watched the Trinity test explosion have become somewhat infamous in modern times. He is alleged to have quoted from the Bhagavad Gita, one of the holiest texts in Hinduism, one which was written in the second half of the first millennium BC, and the title of which approximates to the Song by God. The Gita is a 700-verse scripture, which primarily revolves around Prince Arjuna and his guide, the Hindu deity Krishna, on a wide range of moral and religious matters. It is widely and mistakenly believed that Oppenheimer quoted a line from the Gita in which another Hindu god Vishnu says, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." Although the line would have been a fitting utterance that morning in New Mexico, in reality, Oppenheimer never said this. Instead, recalling the event 20 years later, he said that another line from the Gita ran through his head, one in which it is stated, "If the radiance of 1,000 suns were to burst at once into the sky, that would be like the splendor of the Mighty One." On reflection, in 1965, he thought the other line would have been more fitting, but despite the myth that has developed, Oppenheimer never actually uttered the words, "I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." However, for what in retrospect should have been a sobering moment, the general reaction in the observation shelters was one of glee that the Manhattan Project had succeeded. Oppenheimer, it was later noted, was jubilant. The ramifications of their success, though, would become all too clear within a matter of weeks. Within weeks of the Trinity test explosion, the atomic bomb would be used as a weapon of war. By that time, the conflict in Europe had come to an end, as the Allies had streamed into Germany from both east and west in the spring of 1945, leading to Hitler taking his own life in Berlin in late April, and the Nazis surrendering just over a week later. However, the Empire of Japan had indicated no willingness to surrender, and Japanese honor systems and military culture seemed to suggest an invasion of the Japanese islands would be necessary to bring the war in the Pacific to an end. The US government had calculated that this could result in millions of deaths as the Japanese would fight to the bitter end. Consequently, the decision was quickly taken to utilize the new atomic bomb as a demonstration to the Japanese government of the new weapon which was available to the administration, which was now headed by President Harry Truman, who had succeeded to the White House following President Roosevelt's death in office in mid-April 1945. The result was the bombing of the Japanese city of Hiroshima, with one of the little boy bombs on the 6th of August 1945. In Los Alamos that evening, Oppenheimer was triumphant and seemed to regret the fact that the weapon had not been available to use against the Nazis in Germany. However, this mood quickly gave way to disillusionment 3 days later, when the US dropped a second bomb of the Fat Man type on the city of Nagasaki in Japan. Surely Oppenheimer and his colleagues concluded this was not acceptable. After all, the Japanese had not been given enough time to process the implications of the first bomb and to decide to surrender, which they did 6 days after the bombing of Nagasaki. With that, the war came to an end. The bombings of Hiroshima...
Oh. Okay. Well, let's go ahead and get this commercial out of the way. I understand why he would be upset they used it so fast, but 3 days...
The bomb...
3 days is a long time. Especially... I mean, what time do you need them to do? Do they have to go there and inspect the devastation? They could have done that in a day. 3 days is a long time in war. Don't believe me? Ask a soldier on the front line. Minutes or hours, hours or days, you know. Would it have been nice if a ceasefire was called in that moment so they could inspect and they could decide, sure. But you're also saying that, let's say Japan does a ceasefire with the U.S. The USSR, the Soviets, Russia, whatever they're supposed to be called then, they're still fighting. So, you know, it's tricky.
Bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki remain the only two occasions in world history when nuclear weapons have been utilized in warfare. They are accordingly enormously controversial. Today, most analysts of the events of August 1945 tend to take the same view as Oppenheimer and his colleagues did, that the use of the first bomb in Hiroshima was somewhat justifiable, though imminently regrettable at the same time, as a means of forcing the Japanese to surrender and in the process potentially saving millions of lives by avoiding a land invasion of the Japanese archipelago. But most are agreed that the bombing of Nagasaki just 3 days later was unwarranted. More broadly, the ethical implications of the work Oppenheimer and his colleagues carried out as part of the Manhattan Project during the war have been questioned. There are two sides to this. On the one hand, the development of nuclear weapons has introduced an existential threat to humanity's survival in modern times. But on the other hand, the nuclear deterrent has ensured that the world's superpowers and large states have avoided major wars ever since 1945. For centuries, Europe's states had been endlessly at war with one another. That all changed once it became apparent that direct conflict could result in mutually assured destruction. Ironically, the impact of the development of nuclear weapons has been to foster a nuclear peace, but the risks remain profound in a world where politics are becoming more antagonistic and destabilized during the 21st century. With the end of the war, Oppenheimer's reputation was at an unprecedented height within American academic circles. There were accordingly new opportunities open to him, and he decided to leave Berkeley and head to the East Coast to take up a position as director of the Institute for Advanced Studies at Princeton in New Jersey in 1947, an esteemed center for the study of physics in the United States, which included Albert Einstein, Niels Bohr, and Paul Dirac as former charter members or visiting fellows. Under Oppenheimer's leadership, it became a center for emerging physicists, and when he left Berkeley, a half a dozen of his more promising graduate students left also to study at Princeton. In New Jersey, he continued the methods he had developed in California in the 1930s, producing an environment of energetic discussion and research, often at the expense of his own research. Oppenheimer choosing to write and publish very little himself at Princeton. As a result, the institute became the leading center for the study of physics in the United States in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Many of the most important physicists of the second half of the 20th century passed through the institute, notably Yoshiro Nambu, a Japanese-American who in 2008 would be co-awarded the Nobel Prize for his role in discovering the spontaneous broken symmetry in subatomic physics, and Murray Gell-Mann, who won the Nobel Prize in 1969 for his work on elementary particles. As well as his work at Princeton, Oppenheimer continued to hold a number of government positions throughout the late 1940s and into the 1950s, while also having security clearance to view classified documents and material relating to the United States' evolving nuclear program. Notable in this respect was his membership of the newly established Atomic Energy Commission, which had been founded in 1947 as a commission headed by the United Nations, itself a newly created body designed to foster world peace in the aftermath of the war. The Energy Commission was charged with regulating the proliferation of nuclear materials and the development of nuclear weaponry. While the United States was for several years the only nation with access to nuclear bombs after 1945, it was only a matter of time, now that the world had seen that it was possible to develop such weapons, before other nation-states began building their own bombs or trying to develop them. Oppenheimer and several of his former colleagues from the Manhattan Project were central to efforts in 1946 and 1947 to establish restrictions on nuclear proliferation, which are still in force today. As the first chairman of the Commission, Oppenheimer tried to discourage a nuclear arms race between the United States and the Soviet Union in the context of the developing Cold War, but these efforts were in vain, and a major nuclear arms race developed once the Soviets conducted their first successful test of a nuclear weapon in 1949. As news of the Soviet acquirement of a nuclear weapon reached the US in 1949, debate began within the government of President Harry Truman about the development of a hydrogen or thermonuclear bomb, a far more powerful nuclear weapon than the atomic bombs which had been developed under the rubric of the Manhattan Project and used against Japan in 1945. Oppenheimer and a great many other scientists who had contributed to the work at the Los Alamos laboratory between 1942 and 1945 were opposed to such a measure, arguing that such a weapon could not be used in any practical sense in warfare, without causing immense damage and potentially triggering a nuclear war, which would wipe out much of life on the planet. In their petition to the government in late 1949, they stated that the extreme danger to mankind inherent in the proposal to develop thermonuclear weapons wholly outweighs any military advantage. Nevertheless, Truman pressed ahead and greenlit the new program in January 1950. Nearly 3 years later, in November 1952, the first hydrogen bomb was tested on an atoll in the Pacific Ocean. Ivy Mike, as the bomb was named, produced an explosion equivalent to over 10 million tons of TNT and was 450 times more powerful than the atomic bomb which the US dropped on Nagasaki in 1945.
We're going to stop it there. When we come back, we will finish the final 16 minutes. But until then, you're going to have to sit right there and wait until tomorrow as we come out with part 4 of Oppenheimer, Destroyer of Worlds. Technically, he never really destroyed a world, so he can't be a destroyer of worlds. But, you know, we get the point. So, okay, that hurt. Like and subscribe. And until next time, you're going to have a good day, have a good night.